Now, this is a fun topic for me. And this is not going to be an exclusive one, okay? I am not going to cover every single ship which was ever designed and all the admirals' involvement in them. I'm giving you some examples. Some of my favourite examples. Some of the examples which are easiest to look up, and some of the examples which are not so easy to look up, but are still pretty darn cool. And I've gone right the way through the gamut of history to current day. I am starting as far back as we can coherently go before we start getting into the what I call the poetical history age, where we have things written down by people who are writing down history as a story, as a narrative, and it often does contain very good facts. But details like designer of ship and which officer was pushing forward which argument often comes in a far more theoretical package than we necessarily would like to include. And so, yeah, today's video is about how Admirals shape ships. Literally how Admirals shape ship. And it's what forensic engineering, if we go and look at the ships, what that can tell us about the officers who built their nation's fleets and how we can see that. And you can apply this if you want to. Sometimes one of the best ways to work out who is taking the lead, which officer's personality has proved dominant in this process, is to look at the compromises made. Now, you'll regularly hear about naval constructors and their involvement in ship construction, and it comes up a lot because they're the naval architect, they're the designer, right? So they're important. But it's always a client, there's always a relationship with the client, and the voice of the client also matters. And the voice of the client is usually a senior naval officer, or the third Sea Lord for quite a lot of people we're going to talk about in terms of Britain's case, but the various navies have their various positions. And in the US Navy, especially since Zumwalt, it has been the chief naval officer has had a very big voice in those meetings, in those discussions. An outsized voice in many ways in those discussions. And there's also people like Jackie Fisher, etc. So lots of things for us to get to, but the point is, yes, you have a designer, but believe it or not, navies don't go to naval architects. Go off and design your feeling. Go off and design your inspiration. Make it full of light and hope. No, they usually go, we wanted to be able to do this. Then the naval architect brings back a whole load of designs, and the naval officer looks through and goes, I like that one, but I like that bits from that one, and that bits from that one, so I'd like them all included, and I'd like 3 more design studies based on that inclusion, and I want to have a look at them. And they go off away, do them, come back, the naval officer goes, I like that one. Build it. And that's the sort of process you get, and there's sometimes the naval officer usually has to take the designs, sometimes to the rest of the board, in the case of the Admiralty, and show them, with the naval constructor, chief naval constructor coming along. And if they've got a good partnership, they'll basically have it rigged, so they're going to be presenting 2 designs which are good, but not obviously they've got issues, and a 3rd design which is perfect, which the board will select. And the board will then select the generic design, and then they'll go away and they'll have to make design compromises and decisions as they're going on, depending on what materials available, costs, changes in technology during construction process, etc., which all just go to the 3rd Sea Lord and come back. And again, similar cases happening in other navies. Every navy has their own example. I'm giving you the Royal Navy one because I'm writing books about 3rd Sea Lords at the moment, and I've been putting that all together, so I've got that process firmly in my brain at this current time. Now, with all this, there is therefore chances for the naval officer's personality to come through. In many ways, the ships designed are a fusion of the technical skill of the constructor, the architect, and sometimes the engineers, but the imagination of the naval officer. Because it's not the naval architect who's going to go, drawing on my 30 years experience designing ships, I imagine warfare is going to be like this, so this is what I need to design a ship to be able to do. No, that's the naval officer who is going to go, yeah. During my service, yes, Yeah, we're not going to need to worry about that. There was honest discussions, and someone would talk about some of these ships, about some of the fights of some of the forms of warfare they might end up experiencing, and the naval architects often felt that sometimes the naval officers shut them down rather quickly about saying, that's never going to happen again. Just not. This was especially interesting post-World War II. Post-World War II. But let's start off with me talking about this, because when we're talking about this, about building Navy, about Admirals building, I put out for a title because I wasn't sure what title to use. I was talking a lot about forensic engineering. And what is forensic engineering? Well, forensic engineering is something which historians use a lot. If you're a historian like me who does a lot of to do with things being designed and built. And this is one of the reasons why I ended up teaching history of engineering to engineering students. Because I did so much forensic engineering. And the idea is you take what's built, can be a phone, can be a ship, can be a car, can be a house, and you cycle back through it. And you look at what its specifications were, and you look at what results. And you look at what decisions were made during the process of construction. And sometimes you might not have record of those, but you'll look at the specifications and then you look at the actual built object, and you can do this. Really good example is HMS Warrior. Wander around her. And if you know the specifications and you have get a copy of the specifications, they have books nearby which you can buy, which do have some of the specifications written for her, etc. Wander around her and have a look at some of the decisions that have been made in the contrast of, well, hang on, she was specified to have this, and yet she has it done in X way or Y way. And I'm not going to point specifically out, because Warrior is one of the examples we're going to be getting to in this video. But there's a lot more there when you have time to wander through her, and it's a really fun experience. I did it with students. I did it with my first year batch students when I was at King's, and I took them there, and I gave them a little wonder years. I didn't do it this first year. I did it the second year. Second year I worked it out enough in advance. I did it. I gave them a whole tick box thing, which they could tick off that they'd seen, they understood that had the specification, and they'd gone and seen it, and there was little options of, have they followed the specification exactly, or have they varied it? And they had to tick which one it was, and then they could put in a line about what was the variance. They were quite surprised when they came back and found that not a single time had they ticked it to follow the specification exactly. Every single time there was some variance. Every single time. I was never able to do the same with HMS Belfast, because honestly she had too many modifications done to her throughout her service life, and joys of damage being repaired, that at a certain point, some of the variance is not due to the actual constructors, it's due to, we need this thing to work. But yeah, it's a fun thing to do, and again, you can do that with any ship. I would love to watch people going around New Jersey or things like that, and going through them, and or Midway. Oh, that'd be fun. That'd be so much fun, going through Midway, doing that, and just going through. But of course, she's had modifications on post-career, but there's still stuff there, you can see. There's still stuff, engine room, I'm fairly sure. I can almost guarantee it, without actually having been there. I can guarantee that there'll be variants in the engine room, because the engineers and the naval officers involved in the engineering plant will have had ideas beyond the specifications written, and those ideas will have seen things interpreted. But yeah, this was actually what Bijan suggested as a topic, was when ships gossip about admirals, philosophies of leadership as explained through forensic engineering. And that actually started off what is today's title, which is How Admirals Shape Ships. It's a simple time. How Admirals Shape Ships. And we're starting off really early. We're talking about frigate-built galleons. Or racing galleons. Or race galleons. Sometimes known as the first rasés, because this is actually where rasé comes from, because they were cutting down the galleon design. They were building it from scratch by reducing the forecastle and the stern, so that they were less built up at either end, because galleons are very much built up. It goes carracks and then galleons, and eventually you have race-built galleons, which are not so built up, but basically the idea was you were building fighting positions at either end of the ship. And boarding was still a major part of the structure. But as you're moving towards artillery, you need to start thinking about the ship as an artillery platform. And Sir John Hopkins is an admiral I'm going to talk about later. Sir John Hawkins. It's always fun when you have that many admirals. There are just too many Sir Johns in this one. Sir John Hawkins, with the aid of builders such as Richard Chapman, Peter Pett, and Matthew Baker. Again, I talked a little bit about them recently in the From Mary Rose to Victory. I talked about the Petts. They were important to the design and construction of the Royal Navy ships. And this is the first time there's design work which is really just not an evolutionary of the previous designs. It's really, the carrack has evolved into the galleon. The carrack evolved from the cog. Yes, there are some construction differences, and there are some shaping differences, but they're in evolution. You can actually trace them. The race-built galleon, the rasé galleon, or the frigate-built galleon, depending on your spelling. And by the way, that start off as the Dutch Frygate frigate. Is the first to be described with the head of a cod and tail of mackerel. The thing is, they actually start looking for other objects to see what their design styles can tell them. These are the first ships where we can trace and we can go, well, they were doing not the kind of studies we would do today, not the kind of hydrodynamic modelling we would do and consider our standards of operation today in ship design. No, we're talking about more looking at their ship's performance, looking at some other ship's performance, but also looking at fish, looking at things they could see, and thinking about that, and thinking about what can they do, because what they want are vessels that have speed. What they want is vessels that are stable for their guns, that will allow them to actually use their guns at as maximum range as possible. It's a challenge, though. They don't have any of the computer modelling, any of the things we associate with it, and that's one of the reasons why, to an extent, the ships are also evolutions once they have the idea. And it carries on with Richard Hawkins, who's Sir John's son, and, the ships he built, the ships he wants. They're a major part, though, of what the English force is able to produce against the Armada in 1588. And the main advantage the English had was they could always keep closer to the wind. They could always outsail their Spanish counterparts. And with that ability, they were able to, in many ways, dictate the distance of the engagement to suit their style of combat over the Spanish style of combat. Remember, the Spanish Armada had very powerful ships, traditional galleons, which, if they'd managed to close the distance and carry out a boarding action, would have overwhelmed the English ships without any trouble. Really, the worst thing the English could have find themselves in was a standing fight. Any scenario where they are forced to engage at close range and aren't able to maneuver would have killed the English fleet in that scenario. Because they'd based everything on being able to maneuver. They'd played a hunch. And it worked for them. As long as they're able to maneuver, as long as they're not getting into tight spaces where they can't get away from the Spanish, they're able to do these things. And the ships, the shaping, it comes through. They're getting longer. It's always a pursuit of length to beam ratio, and length is always growing. The length is always growing. And what this starts, though, is an evolution of, in many ways, along this line development into what would become the ships of the line. And it is an evolution. It's this great jump first off where they start making them longer and start reducing the height and thinking and building around artillery, and they take that effort, and then it gets very evolutionary for a long time, and there's a reason for that. Ships have quite long life and they get rebuilt. Yeah, they're not ships of they're ships of Theseus. We'll get on to that. That's a whole lovely philosophical discussion. But also B, they are doing everything with minimal changes and slow evolutions, because if you get it wrong, ships are major investments. Ships are major costs. You don't want to jump in too much. But they still do have some evolutions in the Age of Sail and that era, because you have the Epionomos 74 come out. Now, this is an interesting one, because you see, the French Navy was already starting to develop what I would call a task mentality. They are pursuing a navy which is about accomplishing missions and roles, but they're not necessarily looking at something which is going to be potentially a sea control force. They are certainly flirting with it, and they would like to achieve sea control, but their primary thing is, well, do we want to deliver an amphibious task force? Do we want to deliver this? And it's an interesting policy they're taking, whereas the Royal Navy is sort of going, we want to control the sea, and then we'll figure out how to do everything else afterwards. The French are going, well, if we control the sea, great. If we don't control the sea, we want to be able to do these things. It's the way they're putting the emphasis in their design. And one of the things that's coming up is, rather like with the Frigate Built Galleons, the French are noticing that their 70s and even their 64s to an extent are a bit stubby. And so they start figuring out, well, how about if we lengthen them? The trouble is, if you lengthen them, it's very tempting to go up and have lots more guns. But what they then thought was, well, hang on, what happens if we lengthen them and then we give them a lower gun deck which has the same firepower as a first rate? Or a second rate, a triple decker ship. So we put in 36-pounder, etc. Cannon in the lower deck, and we give them a really good firepower. And the guy dealing with all these ideas coming from the various admirals in the French Navy, because at this point the French Navy is going through one of its usual periods of, oh, new week, new admiral. It happens to the French. This is an ongoing trouble. One of the things that you have to often explain as a British naval historian when you start poking through the various things and pointing out the various developments in naval history of ship design, etc. People often go, oh, you're being biased to the British. I go, no, go hunt them out. Find that Britain has a reason that it's usually at the front. One, it has consistent ongoing investment. Two, it has consistent ongoing leadership, which it doesn't tend to kill off. So they can usually pass on their information, which helps retain institutional memory. And three, and this is most important, it doesn't tend to get its major ports and bases either wrecked by siege, bombardment, or blockade. Mostly because it's the one doing them to people, okay? Mostly, to be fair, because it's the one doing it to people. And that allows for development and evolution to take place naturally, and a lot more thought process to be applied to the ship design, and is one of the reasons why the Royal Navy stays in the position it does for the time it does. When you look at the other nations, you find that that's a very rare scenario. The Royal Navy is very fortunate. Unfortunately, if you look at our army history, that the army tends to be the service which suffers in the British history. They tend to have to make do with what they've got for quite a lot of period. The Navy does come first. When it comes to, the Navy might not get as much funding. The Army often gets more funding than the Navy, but the Navy gets funding first. So they first fund the Navy's project first. Anyway, with the 74s, the French were thinking, well, let's extend it. Let's, make it a bit longer, increase that length to beam ratio, so make them a little bit faster, a little bit better, and let's have those heavy guns. And that gives them a great firepower. It gives them the ability to match in against some of the toughest ships built available at that time. It gives them good speed, which is important. Cost-wise, they are more expensive. They were, for the French, considered a lot more expensive. But the trouble is, some of the first ones they built get captured by the British. And the British love them. Because they work out that with some modified rigging and a few things, it's actually a perfect tool for the Royal Navy. Because its length to beam ratio and heavy guns mean that whilst it doesn't have as many guns as you could cram in if you were going with the smaller guns, it can be more efficient to be crewed by a smaller number of personnel for its size than maybe, other navies might prefer to go with. And the Royal Navy loves it, and so they just build and build and build. And the trouble is, once that happens, is basically the French and everyone else gets sucked into building it as well. And at a certain point, the Royal Navy starts going, "Ooh, we quite like the idea of an 80-gun ship," and everyone else is looking at them going, "We hate you." Quite rightly so. Really rightly so, because it's a two-deck ship. The advantages of a two-deck ship are its stability. And if you're building it as strong as you're building it to take those heavy guns, you are basically giving it timbers that are equivalent to a first-rate ship in terms of its lower hull, and that's what is the real expense. The expense is making those timbers fit the position. It's getting the guns. It's making timbers into the shapes required, because there's that thicker timbers. But even with that being said, the sustainability of them becomes the big factor. And once you start having France building as many as they do, and Sané or San? I've heard it pronounced both ways. Jacques-Noël. His designs include Temeraire class. His designs include some of the most he is one of the most productive, prolific French naval architects, and he's the one who starts the real sort of idea within the French Navy of the architects being these visionaries. One of the things he seems to have found most annoying, though, is the fact that the British, whenever they capture his ships, do not keep faithfully to his design. They mercilessly adapt it. A British 74 will, on average, have a slightly wider beam than their French counterpart to be more stable, and will have a slightly different arrangement in terms of how their stores laid out, and as I said, a very different rigging arrangement, because the British shape their crewing, their rigging, everything down to run on as minimal crew as possible. Mainly because the Royal Navy wants to, if they can save 100 people per ship, let's say you require 600 crew, normally for a ship, but they can get away with 500. Great. Then that means they can now, if you're 600, you're crewing 5 ships, they're crewing 6. And for Britain, that's important, because for Britain it has often more complicated population requirements than some of its continental counterparts. Sometimes its population is doing well. Britain is occasionally one of the more populous nations in the European area of operations. And please note I'm saying European area of operations, because Britain it's part of the wider European continent, but it's kind of like Japan is part of the Asian continent, and Australasia is a continent. When you're looking at some parts of that continent, they are separated off by enough water and enough ways that they are distinct. So when you have large plagues and the wars ravaging across the European continent, the British population tends to be not as affected by those things. And that means the British population might be officially smaller, but in terms of real terms of how many available adult men, mostly, they can put to sea, they sometimes have a real terms advantage. And they will exploit that when they have that advantage. It's, again though, this is going to be this is the first time I really started this of the British taking advantage of someone else's invention, in the way that the Spanish didn't take advantage of the frigate built galleon. They didn't spot it and go, "Oh, actually that might suit us," because for the Spanish, their naval warfare was all about amphibious warfare. Their naval warfare was all about the boarding, because of the Mediterranean, because of the galley warfare and their logic. So for them, it didn't make sense. For the British, this idea made sense, so they adopted it and turned it into something which was even bigger than the French had planned. Even bigger than the French had planned. Which leads us to HMS Warrior. The next time when the British basically take a French idea, something the French have put forward, and come up with a good idea. Now, this is where we have a really fun piece of history, and you might notice there's a picture not here. I haven't put a picture of the French ship, the Gloire. And there's a reason I haven't. Because, honestly, the Gloire is not... It is the French going, "We've done this first!" Now, the really interesting thing is the debate that goes on between the British admirals as to what will be the response to it. Once they hear the Gloires being built, there are ideas. There are lots of people who have ideas. There are lots and lots of people who have ideas. And I'm going to talk a bit through them. I've prepared a little bit of a nice sort of outline to begin with, to make sure, and I'm going to read to make sure I cover all the names. So, this takes place in the pre-Third Sea Lord world, where the Third Sea Lord is not the controller of the Navy, and so it's prior to 1869. So they are the Third Sea Lord, but they're not the control of the Navy, but they're doing a lot of the Third Sea Lord things and have a lot of Third Sea Lord responsibilities, but they're not the control of the Navy. That's another naval officer, and controller is the powerful post. Remember, I've talked about this before in other videos. A lot of the foundations for it that have been for Warrior had been laid by decisions of Sir Alexander Milne, who became Third Naval Lord in November 1857, after serving as 4th Naval Lord since January 1853, and prior to that being 5th Naval Lord since March 1852, and had even had prior experience as 4th and 5th even earlier than that. But he's replaced by Sir Henry John Leake in April 1859. With Milne becoming 4th Naval Lord again, and Leake was replaced by Charles Eden in June 1859, who would hold the post till he became 2nd Naval Lord in June 1861. All done with the assistance of Isaac Watts, Chief Constructor 1860 to 1863, Thomas Lloyd, Chief Engineer of the Navy 1847 to 1869, and Rear Admiral Sir Baldwin Wake Walker, Surveyor of the Navy 1848 to 59. And that was when the post was changed. Would serve in the role of controller, because surveyor was combined with controller for the Navy from 1859 to 61. And it's Wake Walker who's often credited the decision to make a 40-gun frigate. And so let's consider this. Let's consider what we're talking about. Now, what we have to talk about is that whilst Milne had laid the grounds for a lot of technology, a lot of the board came from a background of ships of the line, status assets, and status ships. And they thought the natural response to something like the Gloire, which was a very small ship, was to go for something which would be very naturally very high status. There was one worry though. If they go for something high status, i.e. a 2-decker or something like that, then they risk producing a ship which might not be deployable, might only sit in Britain, and therefore the obvious thing for the French to do with the Gloire would be put it out in the colonial areas and have it destroy whatever the British put out there. And well, whilst they're all debating this, comes up Wake Walker. Now, he is a highly special dude. He really is a highly special dude. I cannot overstate how much of a special dude he is. He is obsessed with building a heavy frigate. He is obsessed with a 40-gun heavy frigate. He thinks it's the perfect ship. The man keeps trying to build them and keeps building them bigger and breaking them. Keeps building them bigger and breaking them. The Mersey and Orlando Mersey class from 1858 are a good example of this. And they achieved 30 knots under steam. They had 40 guns. All those things. They are, in many, many regards, the proto-unarmoured warrior and Prince of Black Prince. They are those ships, unarmoured. And the thing is, as controller, he can stack things. And so whilst naval lords have been pushing the technology, are responding in many ways because of the question from Queen Victoria when the Gloire is being launched, can we match this? Can we deal this? It gets pushed through as a heavy frigate. I don't think he had any idea he was going to create the new frigate around and find out, the first ever frigate around and find out, obviously, ship, which really put that in, the frigate around and find out. I definitely don't think he thought he was building the ship of its the ship which would dominate its period. The absolute beginning of a new generation, the thing which would completely wipe out Gloire to the extent that people often forget Gloire even existed. They think Warrior was the first major sailing ironclad, and she wasn't. I don't think he thought that. The board thought they were getting a ship which they could sail around the world, which is one of the reasons why they built two of them. So they could have them wandering off to different places, and they could be going off and doing things. They would spend most of their time in the UK, but the fact is they could be going off around the world. They could be going to do things. And that was important. But there's a very real debate which could have seen them end up as 80 gun, possibly even 84 gun, two deck ships with, again, there was a debate as to whether you just armoured the lower gun deck or you armoured both gun decks. There's all sorts of discussions going on at this time, which is really quite an interesting time. I'm not quite sure how they go with the idea of having a lower gun deck armoured and the higher gun deck not armoured, because then getting the ammunition in out to feed the upper gun deck is constantly going to be a problem of if that's hit by shells and goes boom and you have powder leading into through a door into there's no way you're going to do it. You're going to end up having to make that an armoured space as well, which is going to be an interesting thing from the weight perspective, but they seem to feel they could do it from some of the things I've read. But those were very, very early discussions, because very early on, our lovely Rear Admiral here, who was pictured when he was in Turkish service, helping the Turkish Navy sort themselves out, Wake Walker. Sir Baldwin Wake Walker. It's actually quite a cool name if you think about it. Name's Wake Walker. Sir Baldwin Wake Walker. Yeah. Very early on, he is pushing heavy frigate, heavy frigate, heavy frigate. I think I can understand it. It is a very sensible idea for them to be pushing at that point, because if you're not sure where the technology is going to go, the heavy frigate, especially of the size with the firepower they're putting into them, is a very balanced asset to deploy. A very balanced asset to deploy. And it's not as if Britain doesn't have steam-powered ships of the line, etc., and big things to sit above it. But that's one of the interesting things, again, when we get into this, because there is the very real possibility that if Warrior had been built, and then immediately the French had turned around and built a bigger, better thing to counter it, then you could well have seen two-decked ships of line style warrior sorts of ironclad coming into service, and those would be really interesting. But that didn't happen because basically the British built two, which were bigger, better, faster, very quickly, and that's how they dominated. They, instead of going for you can argue in some regards that if they'd gone for the size bigger as well, they'd have almost pushed too far. The Warrior Black Prince were an elegant response to the problem. They were overpowering enough without looking like you were afraid, because it doesn't look like you're overcompensating. That's the thing. Sometimes if you respond to what someone's laying down, if you respond to how someone in too big a manner, too overstatement, you can look like you're actually weak. Because it's a well-known thing. People bluff to cover up weakness. You try and make yourself look stronger than you are. So you push yourself more than you actually than you're actually able to do. And humans do that all the time. Well, so do nations. So the thing is, that's one of the reasons why it's interesting when you see these ships being built and you realise the context of the time in terms of the naval race that was going on. And Wake Walker had been around for pretty much all of that Anglo-French naval race sort of going on at the time. You can see that when you're looking at context what decisions they're making. Because they have options. They do have options. One of the really interesting things to me is the fact they just go with two of them. Their other option would have been, rather than bigger vessels, to have gone with more than two. And I would have liked the Royal Navy to go with more than two, but honestly, at this point, it made sense. It's probably the maxing out the capacity of what they could build at that time. So if you're going to build any more ships, they'd probably be successive. And you might as well wait till you've tested out the design before you do that, so you can make sure that it's an improved and better design than you've originally built. But I will emphasize, without Wake Walker, without his obsession with heavy frigates, there is a goodly chance that what comes out is an ironclad late model ship, a steam ship at a line, probably third-rate ship at a line, in terms of capabilities, in terms of what it is, in terms of gunnery, because of the admirals who are in the ministry, the admirals in the Admiralty, the various people involved in government at this point, because I would say they're a little bit more conservative, and they would want a lot more of an edge in terms of firepower, because whilst the speed, whilst the manoeuvrability, whilst the quality of the armor and the hull shaping might give you the edge, taking more than double the firepower with you so you could overwhelm them as well as having those advantages definitely would give you the edge. And Wake Walker felt this was enough and pushed this through. I'm not sure if others would have felt it was enough without it. One of the interesting things is when I'm teaching about conflict management and national security and national risk, I often bring people back to the arguments which were discussed at this point between Wake Walker, between the others, and the reports we have of those arguments, because we don't have a fully detailed account. And it's a really interesting early form discussion of quite a lot of the modern ideas we have around conflict management, around how to deter and how to manage the risk of conflict. And the other thing was, he put forward was that if you went for too big a response, that could be seen as a challenge because it could show everyone else how weak they are compared to you, and so they start building up so you lose your own competitive edge. Britain at this point has an infrastructure edge. It could build bigger if it wanted to. But it only maintains that infrastructure edge as long as no one else is investing in the infrastructure. And that doesn't have to compete on the infrastructure investment perspective. The moment it does start after competing, then it becomes a costly problem to maintain. They'll probably try to maintain it, but it's going to cost a lot of money, i.e. witness the Anglo-German naval race in terms of quantity, but also the Anglo-American, Italian, Japanese naval race in terms of quality, with honourable mention going to the Austro-Hungarians. Please note French, Spanish, and even the Germans and the Russians really don't get involved in that one in terms of the qualitative race. The Germans, because again they don't want to push the costs up of the ships, because the more they get more expensive their ships get, the more they run into the risk of having a political fight with the army, and then they're going to lose that. So they don't want that. Royal Navy never has to worry about that at this point. At this point, they do later on, but we'll leave that to one side. So, this is a managed evolution. This is a managed stomping. This is a managed. We've escalated, and we built 2 of them. You know we could build bigger. Take the L. It's a moderate one, and just keep it within the game. Because the other thing is, and this is strange, but a qualitative race can actually be a way to de-stress international relations and a national situation in terms of fear. A quantitative race will always precipitate more fear. It will cause more trouble because you're building against each other in terms of numbers. That's raw fighting power. However, qualitative race, who has the bigger ships, who has the bigger guns, who has the best ships, is often a more theoretical discussion. And usually everyone can feel like they're winners involved. And it's more about a positive application of national pride, but also it can give you confidence in your nation, which it can actually mean you are better at negotiating. Because nations who are confident will tend to negotiate from a position, feel they're negotiating from a position of strength, and therefore are more likely to actually go into negotiations with prepared to compromise and prepared to reach an agreement. Nations which feel afraid, well, they tend to either negotiate under fear, in which case they're conceding these things now, planning to change them later when they're not so weak, or it's going to cause ongoing antagonism, as it's going to be something they burn under, pretty much, is the phrasing we tend to use. It's interesting. But yeah, that's Warrior. An example of early conflict management. Shane's Book Club time. So recently, someone suggested actually I should put one of my own dogs in here, and instead of the Spreadshirt store one. And the honest reason I don't is because both my dogs, when they get their bandanas on, prove very, very possessive and don't want to take them off of their bandanas. They are very possessive. Raleigh goes into full boxing mode. If you don't know what that is, I'll get a video of it sometime when the poodle, he stands on his hind legs and does this with paws. It's funny as anything. It is funny. He doesn't like me always calling it his boxing mode because he finds that a bit cruel, but I tell him that's what he's doing. So, Shane's book plug. Well, thank you everyone for supporting the channel. Hope you liked today's video. I didn't want to disclose some of these ones a long way in advance. I wanted to keep my powder dry, so to speak, as to when they were coming, and so that's what some of the empty gaps were. Some of them are waiting for your suggestions, but some of them will quite literally are topics which I want to keep my powder dry till I get there. With that being said, Travels, Battles, and Airings. It's my book. And there is another one coming out soon, another book. It's all written. The pictures are all in now. So that's all done. Got to edit it, and as I'm spending a week in Wimbledon, I've decided in April, for Justin Craig, the revision company I go to, I decided I'm going to use that week. I'm going to pop up a bit early, and I'm going to spend a day in the archives checking through references one last time before it gets published. And so then I'll do the editing, and it'll probably be end of April now, not end of March. But when it comes out, it should be good. I will hopefully be happy with it, and that will be on Flower Class corvettes. And then I have one which, if I've managed to earn enough of the Flower Class corvettes, will hopefully be funded by that, and that'll be U-class submarines. And then after that, it will be a primer, which will be, they're all going to be 45,000 words, and they're all going to be released on Kindle, both as Kindle digital, normal Kindle things for you to download, and hopefully also for you to download on the iStore, Apple Store, and as Kindle Direct Publishing, where you can order a physical copy of them. The next one after that is going to be Jellicoe's Third Sea Lord, which will be interesting because Jellicoe's Third Sea Lord does a lot of interesting things. A lot of interesting things. There are a lot of things he starts off, and I think a primary of 45,000 words is going to be intriguing for people to read, because it's going to be a short sort of introduction, which is going to be about his career before he was Third Sea Lord, and it's going to be a bit about after his career as Third Sea Lord, of course, but most of it's going to be about his time as Third Sea Lord and what he's doing for the Navy, the changes and ideas he's implementing, what he wants to build. So that's third book in the queue. And who knows, if the books do well, who knows what will come next. That's the thing, is if the books can do well and the videos continue to sustain the research and pay for the research between the books, then I can grow things, and that's the aim, to try and grow things and make things better. So that should be this year's fun. But Shameless book plug in the meantime. If you want to know more about Genesis and Modern Destroyer, please go look up Travels, Battles, and Daring. I, personally recommend it as its author. Completely unbiased, and therefore completely unbiased. Unfortunately, Warrior wasn't going to stay to frigate around and find out solution forever. It never had that chance, and well, the Royal Navy very quickly needed more, and they keep working on them. The next one, which really does fit that criterion, I always use frigate around and find out, because A, it's quite cool as a phraseology, but also it's... in almost every generation there is a weapon system which is, you really don't want this system. You don't want the people who crew it to have to come to war. You really don't want to see them coming your way. There's always something which is to frigate around and find out of every generation. These days, we currently are mostly talking about the F-22 when we talk about that, and still are to an extent talking about the F-22. I don't think it's changed for a while. There's probably going to be something that comes along afterwards, but no. Seawolf class SSN as well. Astute class SSN as well is arguably also up there. They are systems which, in their area, they are... near as enough makes no difference, supreme. Well, the next big one, after the Warriors, that was really everyone was going to look at and go, yep, that's the Admirals. And this is the thing, you can tell when the Royal Navy's seriously trying to deter war. They bring up Admirals. The moment they are bringing in the Admirals, they are trying to deter conflict by basically going, look at our past. look at our history, don't make us repeat it. Don't give us a reason to add names to this list. Don't. Admirals are, other nations, they might use saints, they might use great sort of chivalric figures. The Royal Navy uses admirals. I had a discussion whereby someone was talking about, the various Royal Navy battleships post World War One. They would have been the Saint class. The name for the patron saints of the forearms. No, they wouldn't have been. The M's would not have been. But if they've been going to be called St. Vincent class, I could understand that. That would not surprise me. St. George, the Royal Navy, literally the number of ships that have been named St. George, you can put on one hand. St. Patrick, or any of the other patron saints, near as enough never. There's like one or two ships. Mostly because the Royal Navy associates being called saints, saint names with... they would say at the time, the phraseology they use is popish. It's popish. But to them, that more means it's something which the Franco-Spanish navies, which we've spent centuries beating up, do, not us. It's one of the interesting things is that one of the chief officers who would say that in the Royal Navy, who was talking about that, and this would classify these things and say it's popish. It's not Royal Navy, it's popish. Was actually a Catholic. And you just sit there and go, okay, so surely you're supposed to be the ones who... And you look into it and you realise that their internal lexicon, popish means the navies and the saint names. The appealing to God. We don't appeal to God, we appeal to the admirals. So, this was the Admiral class. They were the frigate around and find out the next generation, realistically. And there's a really good, this is the guy who designed them, William White. Now, he did it working with Vice Admiral Sir William Graham, who is one of the Royal Navy's thinking admirals. And basically his philosophy, as he would go on to teach at the Royal Navy College, Greenwich, when he's president of that after his 10 years Third Sea Lord, is that you need a warship which will turn up, take a beating, take whatever's chucked at it, and hit back harder. That is the key. That is their aim. That is what they need to be. And when you look at Collingwood's design down here especially, you get that idea. She's got those big, thick communicating tubes. She's got the boiler rooms nicely protected, down deep. She's got the various water chambers. When you look at D, you start looking at it and you go, oh, they've got water there, there, and there, which provide extra protection. One of the interesting things about her is she's protected from raking fire. The Royal Navy are still thinking, to an extent, about the idea of getting raked, like Age of Sail ships did. It's still there. And when you look at the tactics at the time, you look at what they have going on, yeah, you can understand it. You can understand it. But, yeah, she's got fuel packing, she's got water ballast tanks. The water chambers, by the way, are literally water as armour. It's water as armour. In fact, water as armour is again being used all around this ship. Water is being used as armour. The water ballast tanks, the water chambers, all those things are being used as armour. Again, we like to talk about the water as armour being something that comes up with Rodney and Nelson and the British doing that in the 1920s. The British have been thinking about water as being part of their armour scheme for a lot longer. And the whole point about these ships they were supposed to be, this turns up, you are finding out. And They could deploy a long way away from the UK. They could go a long way away from the UK. And in fact, they built 6 of them. They built 6 of them as that level of capability. No longer building 2, you're building 6. You build 2 in a world where your opponent builds 1. You build 6 in a world where your opponent builds 3 or 4. This ship, HMS Benbow, because it goes Collingwood at the top, then Anson, then Camperdown, then Rodney, then Benbow, and then Howe. Benbow is the last of them. And she actually has an interesting claim to fame because she is technically the battleship which carries the largest caliber gun the Royal Navy ever fitted. Because HMS Furious was technically a large light cruiser with only a single 18-inch gun, and Monitors had the other 18-inch guns. Benbow carried a 16.25-inch gun. And literally, she carries that to just be able to be big, because the Italians also have some large guns, and so now we need something which has a large gun. But even the Italians didn't think, well, we might have a bigger gun. Do we want to take on an Admiral Class? We'd prefer not to. Because the trouble is, if they think one might not be enough to hang with us and take the punishment and win, they'll send more than one. And that's the real problem. That's the real meaning. Frigating about and finding out... it's often put down as, oh, you'll have one asset or give a couple of assets, which will do this. No. You want to have enough that they go, well, maybe I can beat 1, but I definitely can't beat 2, and they'll be turning up with 3. Which is an existential crisis. Again, it's about conflict management. How does Britain maintain peace in the world? To preserve its empire, because honestly, the British Empire is always a horrendous house of cards. It's a maritime empire dependent upon on a island which is very small in comparison, and very small population in comparison to its empire, to defend and secure it, and provide a protection for the trade routes, the oceanic trade routes, which are its theoretical internal lines of communication. I.e., its internal lines of communication are, by definition, not internal and not not easily securable. That's the reality of it. Well, Britain does that by conflict management, by presenting itself in the best way it can do, both at home and abroad. And they're building the ships, in this case William Graham has built the ships which can do this for the 1880s. And 1890s. He's built ships which are quite literally the definition of a solid lump of survivable material. And you will not grind this ship down as quickly as you need to. And the fact is, the really interesting thing is that, once again, there is the status symbol of the guns, the big guns, and there is the reality of, we've also got all these actual quick-firing guns, which are the guns which will actually do the killing at the ranges we're in dealing with. They're going to be the ones which are going to overload you, are going to pound you with shells, are going to break down your armor. We have a lot of those. It's just we also have some big guns which can do some really massive damage as well if you want them to. If we're lucky enough to hit you on them. And it's an interesting tandem idea of, William Graham has this philosophy of how you're going to fight these battles. And William Henry White turns that philosophy into steel. And one of the really interesting things about White, this is not the only time he's going to do it with a status ship. But here's the question. Why are the French not achieving this? Why are the French, who are the world's second naval paradox point, really not matching in? Well, because they don't have one vision, they have many visions. They have many competing visions, and they're not able to really control them. And this is what leads to the poor Hosh being in the situation where she is, where she's almost confused, and the Carnot, which is, oh no, why? They all have logical ideas behind them. It's just the logic doesn't work once you put it into reality. And this all comes about largely because of the Jeune Ecole scenario. But this is one of the reasons why the Royal Navy gets to look for a period, look in terms of technology, in terms of pushing the boundaries, in terms of setting the standards for what ships are going to be completely set apart from the rest. Because the other options are not in a position to do it, and the nation which should be probably the one pushing Britain the most at this point is instead facing an existential internal crisis of, I don't know, concentration. I'm trying to think of what explains the Jeune Ecole, because the reason I'm quite as critical of the Jeune Ecole as I am is because it's not a new idea when it comes about. It really isn't. In the War of 1812, someone had the bright idea for the Americans, instead of funding a decent navy, instead of having ships of the line, they'd invest in these horse-drawn carriages which would have boats on them which would have a single cannon. And the horses would take the boats to where they needed to be, launch them, and then those boats would together drive off a ship of the line. Every single time they had a fight with ships of the line, or enemy frigates for that matter, they got annihilated. Every single time. Oh, no, it's going to be different. We have spar torpedoes. Then we have regular torpedoes. We have explosive guns. And every time the big ship counters it. The other example we have had more recently is the missile boat age, where people talk about missile boats and go, they can now sink a battleship. They could, if the missile hits hits the battleship. And so what you have is you have surface-to-air missiles and air defense guns. Maybe put them on your battleship or other ships in the task group. And so now the small torpedo boats have to grow larger so that they can carry more missiles. At which point, well, if they're large enough, they're going to be quite easy for aircraft to spot and engage. So now you're going to have to carry anti-aircraft weapons on your torpedo boat, on your missile boat for it to get closer. Okay, so now it's got anti-aircraft weapons, and it's got... Very quickly, you find yourself, you develop quite a large vessel once you're dealing with all the problems. So once you're big enough, you're carrying both anti-ship missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, and able to go fast enough for your darting attack. You're also probably going to be large enough now you're going to have to deal with submarines, which means you're going to need some ASW defense to at least spot torpedoes coming in towards you so you can try and dodge them. And it just grows and grows and grows, and it's the same every time. Every time someone comes up with the idea of, let's make this... let's make a small thing which will do this job really well, it inevitably grows because of humanity. Because of mission creep. And you can, if you want, drones, small boats, anything. You can make it small if you're prepared to accept limited capabilities and a singular focus. If you're prepared to accept those things, you can make it very small. The moment you start wanting to have it as multiple capabilities, say multi-role, and you want to have it have slightly longer range, slightly better speed, all these things, it's going to grow in size and cost. It's been happening as long as history. I'm sure at some point there was some smart Roman or Chinese admiral back in the ancient period who went, you know what, maybe if I have a whole load of small ships, I'll be able to beat the big ships. And maybe you will do, as long as it's a raiding party and you are managing to sneak in and raid them and cut them out and take those enemy ships, capture those enemy ships. If you want to actually have a stand-up fight with them, though, you'll probably have some trouble. Probably have some trouble. But anyway, let's go back to the work of William Henry White, because he gets to also be involved in the Royal Sovereigns. And the Royal Sovereigns are what happens when someone goes, I really like the Admirals. Yeah. They're really good. Yeah. But we need seakeeping. Okay. And eventually they also need turrets and various other things. And these are the vessels which get them. They transition from having these open mounts to eventually by Hood having fully enclosed turrets and becoming the proto. This class is really the transition point from, I would say, the ironclad battleship era, not the ironclad frigate era, which is warrior class, but the ironclad battleship era, to what I call the Royal Sovereign era as a rule, because that's the starting proto point of it, but many people call the pre-Dreadnought era, which I don't believe makes sense because Dreadnought comes afterwards and no one knew Dreadnought was coming, so it can't be pre-Dreadnought because you don't know it's coming. That's okay for us from the future classifying as that, but the people then didn't, so I usually go Royal Sovereign style battleship, and they certainly were the reference battleship for their period. People always talked about it in conjunction compared to the Royal Sovereigns. And this time you have Vice Admiral John Hawkins. Remember, I mentioned him earlier on instead of John Hawkins. John Hawkins, who was a former captain superintendent of Sheerness Dockyard and director of heavy ordnance, who was obsessed with A, making the ships work better for the heavy ordnance to actually work, and B, have better seakeeping. Better seakeeping. That matters. He wanted ships which could go around the world and do what they needed to do when they needed to do it without worrying. He wanted ships that wouldn't have to worry about, well, how to put this, wouldn't be scared of going out in a faintly heavy breeze. The Admirals hadn't been that bad, but other designs had had issues. The Royal Sovereigns didn't. The Royal Sovereigns were focused assets. And you can see this in their construction, in their shaping, how around. There is similarities in their shape between them and the Admirals. There certainly is. But once you look at their beam, once you look at the way their hull's been elongated and shaping, especially towards the stern, and their structuring, you start to realize that things have changed. The hull especially has changed. And these ships are the next generation. These are the evolution. And the fact that they are designed by the same naval architect always amazes me. White is a truly amazing naval architect for his period. I don't agree with everything he does, and trust me, I have listened to enough discussions over the years from my dad, who was a naval architect, about White and about his many mistakes as well as good points, to realize he is a complicated figure in naval architecture history. But the partnerships he builds with Third Sea Lords and how he executes their vision. Yes, you can see the White styling and flair in there. You really can. But these ships are very different to the Admirals. And I would say one of the things you can tell is that one of the reasons you can tell they have the priority of seakeeping is that in some ways the Admirals are actually more dense. In some ways the Admirals are more filled with protection and survivability, whereas these have emphasized ability to stay above water. Although saying that, they do have an 18-inch thick armor belt and a 17-inch thick armor barbettes around their main guns. So, they're not exactly short in terms of their strength. They're not exactly lacking. 18-inch thick metal plates. Yeah. That's a thick belt. I'd say that's the interesting thing, though, when we get onto our next ships. Because our next ships, whereas these have all been designed in many ways around war fighting, but also in around being the symbol of, if you cause trouble for Britain, this is what's going to come. This is what we'll dispatch, and you will not enjoy fighting it. Oh, and by the way, it'll probably bring its friends. The Admirals had 6 members, the Royal Sovereigns had 8. They will bring friends. They will not come alone. And you will have to deal with them. And they will get there and they'll be in fighting condition when they do. It's very different to what Jackie Fisher comes up with. Now, the interesting thing here with these ships is that in some ways you show, or at least Admiral Jackie Fisher showed, the conflict management tool and the conflict waging tool. Conflict management. Conflict waging. Differential here. What are we talking about? Well, the thing is about the battle cruiser, as in the Invincible class, they're all about image. They're all about status. They're all about being able to run around the world sharp, rather quickly, where you don't want to be, and they are, on paper at least, powerful enough that the only thing that'll beat them is one of these. And that's if it catches them when they're first built. And that's the thing. Battle cruisers, really, in the hands of someone like the British Empire, they are about conflict deterrence. They're about the ability to suddenly produce a force where they need it to be, when they need it to be, before you're ready for it there, and for you to have to go, oh, do I want to continue this course of action? Battleships, like Dreadnought, they're what fight wars. They are. They're armoured for it. They're built for it. They're subdivided for it. Everything about them is about fighting a war. They dreadnought. They dreadnought, so they don't dread war. They will wage it. They will probably suffer losses, but the thing is, they'll keep being built and they will wage it. That's the point. In the world of the 1900s and 1910s, there's far too many people building ships, far too many nations competing in the qualitative race and the quantitative race between Britain and Germany, etc., for you to have a frigate around a find-out ship. Perhaps the Queen Elizabeth class, eventually when they come out, but even then, there are already people working on 16-inch guns, there's already people working on faster ships and bigger ships and this, that, and the other. So you don't really have that ability to produce that. The pace of development is too great at that time. The pace of evolution is too great. But what you do have is this sort of distinction whereby some ships built by some nations are honestly more to do with waging peace and conflict management. Trying to head off conflict before it comes conflict. Trying to be able to show up with overwhelming force or the right amount of force before conflict kicks off so as to prevent that conflict happening. That's what the Invincibles are about. That's what the battle cruisers are about. They are about this idea of being able to deter conflict, being able to manage conflict. Yes, they have an economic warfare capability, but that's their theoretical warfighting capability to give them legitimacy as a deterrence tool. You can't build a deterrence tool of a cruise liner. You can't build a deterrence tool of something which has no actual warfighting capability or role. It just doesn't work. It's a laughing stock automatically. So they need to have something, and as the premier economic warfare solution of either both defense against surface raiders and ultimate surface raider, it fits. It's got a capability. But as a warfighting tool, to actually fight battles against the enemy, well, that only works as long as they are weaker. And in the world of the 1900s, when the enemy are building new ships every year, where ships are taking a leap forward every 2 years or so, in quality and capability, you can't really design a ship that's going to be able to do that. Sorry, making my chair squeak here, thinking about it, but the thing is, you can't design a ship to do that, because they're going to be outbuilt too quickly. So you almost have to give up on that as a concept. You have to accept that you're just going to have to keep building improved and better versions of whatever you build. So it comes down to, what are you going to build? What works for you? And with the Invincible class, well, they are about the presence mission. They're about having a presence. There's a very good reason why they are the size they are. Let's start off with, they have 3 stacks. Dreadnought has 2. And stacks which create smoke, i.e. funnels, they are something which people see. They're a visual representation of power. Okay? She's got big guns. She's obviously got lots of engines. She's built to a sleek design with a cut down. The cut down is quite far aft. It's not like the Dreadnought with the sort of cut down forward and these wing turrets. But no, she's still got wing turrets, but they are positioned differently. This is a different beast. This is something very different than Dreadnought, and it's made obvious the fact. Dreadnought is about revolutionary warfighting capability. It's about buying you time. Britain had to make the leap before anyone else did, because otherwise they would lose the status of making a leap, and they couldn't afford that in this scenario, because unlike when the Warrior and the Gloire happened, and the Gloire and the Warrior happened, Britain doesn't have enough of industrial capacity, lead and edge, to be able to do a Warrior moment to anyone who does a Gloire moment in the Dreadnought era. Anyone producing a Dreadnought, Britain cannot do a Warrior to Gloire. They don't have enough of an edge at this point. Conversely, honestly, by about 1910, due to the way the infrastructure's worked and things that have developed, they possibly do have the edge to do that in about 1910 for about a year or so. But outside of that period, they couldn't have done a warrior to anyone's Gloire at any other point in this era. The thing about the Invincibles, though, they're a new ship. I mean, they could have called them a Raze frigate. They could have called them a frigate. They could have called them anything. They didn't. They called them battle cruisers. And that is the part of the reasoning why they don't call them frigates. Part of the reason why they call them battle cruisers. Part of the reason why these things come up is to set them apart and make them this new, interesting, powerful thing, because the image it's going to provide. It's all about the image. It's about the capabilities they apparently have, and it's about the image they project into world leaders' heads. That's their ability. This is the real backbone of the fighting power of the Royal Navy. This is what's going to go around the world and tell the world about it. And that's the thing, because for many people in the world, they may or may not see a battleship. They're more likely to see a battle cruiser. Think about that. The Empire cruisers and the other things that go on in the 1900s, and 1910s, and the 1920s and 30s, the ships which are going around the world are battle cruisers. For many people in the world, the image when you talk about a dreadnought that they will have seen in their head will have been the battle cruiser, not the battleship. And the image this puts in your head is of something which is fast, sleek, capable of getting where it needs to. The reality is something which is a balanced death machine, which owes itself to the lineage of things which started off with the Admiral Class we talked about, and the Royal Sovereigns. But the image is different, and that's part of the reason why we have some of the interesting discussions we do today about Dreadnought battleships. Because the image has persisted. The image of the Dreadnought era was the battlecruiser more than the Dreadnought, because more people saw it. And so that became the image in people's heads when they're retaining a cultural memory. It's one of the most curious things of history to think about. In the Dreadnought era, it was more common for people around the world to have seen a battlecruiser than a battleship. It's more common in person. Which leads us to the next World War. Now, there was never any doubting that if I was going to do admirals putting their personality into things, I was going to talk about Admiral Henderson if I did a video about it. And honestly, I would love to do the book about him, and that's on my list of books to do. But it's kind of interesting when we start looking at Ark Royal and Illustrious as compromises, and Stanley Goodall and the various people involved in their design and construction, and Henderson's personality coming through. Because what did Henderson want them for? What comes through? What is the linking ideas which synergize these two together? Is it just the Royal Navy's plan for naval aviation? Again, I've done a video on this channel about that, about their concept. And one of the things which I always remind people is, navies can have concepts of operations that they are building towards. The thing about a concept of operation is they're building towards it. It's what they would like to do if they have all the equipment they're asking and they're going to get, they want to get, and they've got on the list of procurement. That's their concept of operations. How they fight a war can be very different, because the odds are they don't get all that equipment they had in their concept plan. And if they don't get it, they're going to have to adjust around it. And also, the war is probably not going to go how they conceived it would go, so they're probably going to have to change and adapt on the fly. Anyway, the interesting thing is how much of the concept of operations actually survives the war. For both scenarios, the Royal Navy starts off with their perfect carrier. Their perfect carrier was about 27,000 tons in standard displacement. Had an armoured deck not too dissimilar to the Illustrious class in terms of an armoured box, but was about the size in terms of air group and operating capabilities as Ark Royal. Had the torpedo defences and structural integrity, which the Illustrious class had, but had the hangar space and certainly some of the range of operations in terms of its own engineering spaces of the Ark Royal. Now, if that's the dream Royal Navy carrier, and they design that in every design study, variations of that, then the compromises they reach under the treaty limitations to deliver something must tell you what they're prepared to compromise on. Now, when you consider that Ark Royal's the strike carrier and the Illustrious class are the fleet carriers, one's supposed to hang back and be used as the big punch, or if the enemy's hiding in harbour, be used as the lead of the big punch for that, and one is supposed to be closer to the battle line, providing the air support for ongoing fleet battle operations, providing the ongoing strike, the constant of operations, and that's so much harder to do without actually getting a bag to hit. But yeah, the constant flow of operations. Every time I do this maneuver without having a bag to hit, I just realise how difficult it is for me without the bag to hit. Well, that's one side. The point is, that's what the Royal Navy are building around. The thing is, what's always interesting is Illustrious is the smaller air group and ends up being the heavier design. Because they're prepared to compromise on air group size, but not survivability of the carrier. There's a reason for that. People immediately go Mediterranean, and that is a factor. It's always a factor operating in the Mediterranean. They have done enough studies, they know there's going to be aircraft wherever you go in the Mediterranean, you're going to be dealing with land-based aircraft. But I also reckon the same in the South China Sea, and the same if they're trying to do a blockade of Japan. You must remember the British war plan for war versus Japan, which is the thing which dominates a lot of their naval thinking for the late 1920s and early to mid 1930s is war against Japan, and it's Japan and the Royal Navy are pointing guns at each other in January 1939 and January 1940. The Asamamaru incident in 1940, the Tsingtao incident in January 1939. And that's just two events in that period. That is just two events in that period. Sorry. It's just two events. And there are dozens of others. So it's very realistic for the Royal Navy to be planning war against Japan. They're the ones who they're actually pointing guns at in peacetime and who are pointing guns at them. If they weren't planning for war versus them, you'd be asking questions. I've had this conversation with people over the years several times who go, well, they should be planning for war with Germany. Germany in 1930 doesn't count. Germany in 1930 is still out for the count thanks to the Treaty of Versailles. And Italy, whilst they are a threat compared to Japan, no, they're not. Not the same scope at all. So the British war plan was to blockade Japan and starve them into submission. Which, honestly, they could probably have done. Under their operational doctrine, they could probably have done it. It would have been an interesting one. It wouldn't have gone flawlessly for either side, but Britain has the resources and has the Empire resources and capability to sustain that kind of operation. But leaving that to one side, the big issue for Britain was operating carriers or any ships on the other side of the world from their industrial and infrastructure base. And what kind of industrial and infrastructure can they support forward? What kind of facilities can they move forward to sustain things in the Far East? Because if you have a damaged carrier that can be easily repaired forward, that's far better for you than having something which is damaged to the extent it needs to be repaired back home. So, a carrier which carries less aircraft but is going to take less damage or be more easily repaired is a better option for you than necessarily an aircraft carrier which carries more aircraft, but if it takes damage, it's going to be more difficult to repair. Even with the limitations and the need for a forward aviation support ship to actually support them and sustain and provide the engineering facilities for the aircraft that you normally carry in your own carrier. Ideally, the best thing would be to have both. Would be have all the resources. That's what we call the implacable class. There is a reason why they are able to come out the design they are so quickly with so little effort. That's because pretty much that's ripping the this was our dream design off the design block. So what's the compromise in Ark Royal? Well, it loses some of its torpedo defences, but it's supposed to be hanging back further. And it loses some of its subdivision and some of its internal protections, and all things which would have been useful actually when it did find itself into war. But the thing is, you have to make the compromises. To get the ship built, to get the vessel into service, you have to make compromises. And yes, 27,000 tons is the limit. It's the tonnage limitation of what you can build up to. Yay! At this point, and then it goes down to 23,000 tons. But you only have a cumulative limit of 135,000 tons. So if the Royal Navy builds them all to 27,000 tons, 27,000 tons in standard, they only have 5 carriers. Try and defend the British Empire with only 5 carriers. You can't. This is why you drop down to 23,000 tons, 22,000 tons, because that can allow you to get more. that can allow you to get 6 or 7 carriers, maybe even. Depending on how you work it out, depending on how the challenges work out. As always, the cumulative limitations were always far more of a problem than the individual hull limitations. Even with battleships, the 35,000 ton standardization limitation does stop you building the best capital ships you could build, but it's the cumulative limitation which really causes you trouble. Because if you can build as many as you like, then it doesn't matter if they're limited to 35,000 tons, you just build more. With the Illustrious class, you can tell they're compromised. Deck parking, which is something the Royal Navy doesn't like doing. Why? Because when they've tried deck parking, especially in the North Atlantic and North Sea, they have a habit of losing the aircraft to the ocean. It's not nice. And before you're asking, do they tie them down? They do. At one point, the North Sea even took the ropes that were being used to tie them down. The North Sea is vicious. The Royal Navy is right to ask if it's out to get it. It is right to not even question if it's out to get it anymore, just presuming it is. With the Illustrious class, there are other compromises. Not just the deck parking for the air group size, but also there's hangar height for its maintenance and restricting you to certain types of aircraft and with certain type of wing folds. There's all sorts of issues. Compromises brought in. And they're brought in because of the desire to make the carrier as survivable itself as possible. And again, I would normally point out, these are both designed in a pre-radar world. Radar's coming, but they don't know when it's going to get there. And they haven't yet developed the fighter control for radar. They have the zoom and boom tactics, but they are based on visual identification. And that's great in a world where aircraft move at 100 miles an hour. When aircraft are moving at 200 miles an hour or faster, that suddenly becomes less viable, because suddenly that distance there, a bit of visual identification, they're covering very, very quickly. Very, very quickly. And you've got to deal with that. And that's just not going to really be a good idea, is it? That's not going to work. So for both these ships, they are both compromises. How Henderson compromised to achieve the fleet carrier, its air group size, and where it's organised and where it's based from. How Henderson compromised to achieve the strike carrier, survivability. This one is trying to depend more on distance and speed to make up for that issue. This one, well, she's got all sorts of tricks for trying to deal with the air group one. And honestly, the biggest dealing with the air group one would probably be if they actually produced what I tend to go with the Supermarine Seafire option, which was the gull-winged aircraft that the Supermarine were working on at the same time as they were developing the Spitfire originally. The Seafire originally, believe it or not, was not going to be a modified Spitfire. It was going to be a gull-winged aircraft built with a very similar body and fuselage to a Spitfire, but very different wing construction because it was a gull wing shaped, and it was very different sort of design of wing, which would have actually worked. It's an interesting thing of when they have all the development behind them, one wonders if they had, instead of being charged with converting Spitfires into Seafires, if they'd been said, okay, with as much commonality as possible, build a Seafire, what they would have done. Would they have taken a later model Spitfire airframe and stuck gull wings onto it? Possibly. Would that have had as an impact on operations on carriers? I don't know, but they didn't. They couldn't, and that didn't happen. But again, the small single-seat fighter would have been an interesting thing to have for the Illustrious class. It could have allowed them to get their air group strength up more earlier, because one of the trouble they have, and this is one of the things which does make the British air groups look smaller than they were, is the size of the aircraft involved. The fact that they use two-seater aircraft for everything does have an impact on your overall air group size. It does. But things don't stop there, because we get to the nuclear navy, and how much effect does Rickover have? Now, Rickover, what can I say about him? He's probably an example which, if I hadn't included in here, would have probably got me absolutely drummed out on naval history, because he is the ultimate example of personality, of an admiral stamping their personality over something. His obsession with safety, with perfection, and with standards is well known. The level of, how do I put this, weirdness that seems to percolate around various parts of his involvement in the programs is also well known. He had an impact. He was an officer who could do some very demeaning things to juniors if he felt it would be a learning opportunity in his mind for them. I'm not sure making people stand to attention in your office all day or just those sort of things really helps anyone, but I know some people believe it. I don't think it really does help. I just don't. Having them sit in the corner of your office all day while you're you're meeting with people and doing things so they can see what you do and how you do it, that could be an instructional lesson for leadership. Making them stand at attention in the corner the whole day while they're doing it kind of makes it a bit more of them concentrating on the punishment than them necessarily thinking about the reality of what they could be learning from it. That just seems to me more that case. But ultimately, how has he felt about? Well, the USN ran and has run one of the most successful nuclear submarine programs and surface vessel programs of any nation in the world. One of the safest, and one of the most, I would argue, able of delivering on what its stated goals were. They've produced a submarine arm which is second to none, which has honestly dominated the world for most of the Cold War and into the current day. US submarine service is world class, world beating, is the status symbol in the world. And that's thanks to him. It's not so much an individual design. As every design of nuclear submarine the US Navy has ever produced since he came to power, well, since he was in power, when he came to power and even after he left, has reflected his philosophies in terms of engineering. Has reflected his focus on engineering and on how you approach nuclear power. It's not so much to say that Rickover is the father of the nuclear navy. He is the nuclear navy. His personality, good or bad, was imprinted into the US Navy on a fundamental level as far as its nuclear program went. There is not a single aspect of the program which didn't feel his involvement, for good or for bad. I would argue some of the issues you still have today in the US Navy with their submarine service, especially the crewing levels they require for their subs, are unashamedly, they are undoubtedly consequences of decisions made by Rickover. Conversely, I'd also say the capabilities of those submarines, the quietness, the adaptability, the survivability, and the commitment of the personnel to their duty is also a consequence of of his work. He succeeded, in many ways, in making the submarine service feel not just like an elite profession, but like an elite high-status profession. And there is a difference there. I often tried to point this one out. The Royal Navy destroyers, especially the Trouble class, felt themselves to be the elite of the elite. But they always felt they were a bit of the underdogs in the forces. They were always the underdogs compared to the cruisers, compared to the capital ships, compared to the carriers. They were always the underdogs. They might have been the elite of the elite, but they weren't the high status. They didn't have that as part of their attraction, part of their reason for being. Rickover managed to bring that into the nuclear submarine service. He managed to make them high status and the elite of the elite. And as for the submarines, it's generation upon generation of improvement. Now I'm trying something I don't normally do. Normally I record whole sections again and all these things, but I'm trying to not delay this video going up and just adding in a very short bit, and not spending time re-recording whole sections. But I did the whole stuff about Rickover, and I thought it was very good, and I was quite enjoying it. But I thought I should really talk about the current submarines and how his legacy's been found in them. Because really, the Seawolf was the ultimate expression of it in many ways. Many people thought when they chose the Virginias that they were in some ways going against Rickover's legacy, in some ways going against him, because he's always been striving for the best of the best submarines. But the thing is, his point was always about building the best of the best submarines for the crews, so they'd be as survivable, as safe, and as viable as possible. And the thing is, as Rickover would have told anyone, having enough submarines is just as important as having maybe the individually best submarines. It's the whole argument that goes back to the first rates versus third rates, and why do you produce so many third rates, and why not just produce all ships being first rates? Because eventually you can't afford to crew and produce all the first rates in enough numbers for them to be useful for every single job you need the ship to do. So that's where the third rates come in. They are the vessels which are at the viable point, those 74s which I talked about earlier. And in many ways, Rickover would have been happy with the Virginia being the 74 to the Seawolf's first rate. Rickover would have been happy with that being produced as long as there were enough submarines to maintain the level of training in the crews, to maintain the level of combat readiness, and to maintain enough subs, enough boats available for operations. Because that was always behind his drive for efficiency. Maintenance of the fleet being available. There's no point having boats which are going to sit in the harbour, or boats which your crews can't use, or boats which are killing your crews. These three things do not help you. They don't help you build a force long term. They don't help you build up institutional memory and capability. They don't help you. So yeah. Seawolves, he would have been happy with. Virginias, he'd have been happy with. I think he'd have wanted slightly more Seawolves. I think he would have wanted slightly more than they built. In fact, I'm sure he wanted slightly more than they built. But ultimately, I think he'd have been happy with the mix the US Navy went for. He'd just like more boats overall. He really would. Generation upon generation of improvement. And as long as the tenets of his time, in terms of professionalism, standards, and maintenance, and safety, are kept to, his impact will just continue. But with that being said, he isn't the one I wanted to finish on. Oh no, I wanted to finish on this. And I have to be slightly more circumspect in certain things, because, once you're into more modern world, because, as I said before, this is not War Thunder. I do my PhD's war studies, I do teach naval history right up until the current day. Recently, I've been teaching early operations off the coast of Ukraine in a course, so we really do go right up to the current day. You know, basically, if there's been books written about it, there are enough books that we can give the students to go and look it through. We'll teach it. But that means you have to be careful sometimes about what stats and what figures you use for things. Well, the Zumwalt's babies. See what I did there? Not the Zumwalt class, the Zumwalt babies. You see, the Burkes, in many ways, start off with Zumwalt. They really... Poor Zumwalt is doing all sorts of random things, and after that, you know, he's really trying to push the US Navy to think about its force. One of the things he starts putting the idea is having a general purpose escort, a replacement for the destroyers that have been in service for a few years. You know, something to complement the TCOs, which are these high-end Aegis ships. You've got to have something which is a more general purpose Aegis ship. And so it starts off with some ideas. That then gets taken over by Holloway, and he becomes CNO. And he's basically trying to right the ship after Zumwalt has had a lot of very interesting thought processes going on. And you have Watkins, who honestly is where it starts to crystallize under, in some regards, what they need, and also where things start being added on. Whether they really have the debate of, is this going to be an independent asset, i.e. need its own hangar, or is it going to be a carrier task group asset? Now, when they decide it's going to be a task group asset, it doesn't need its own hangar. Which is rather interesting when you consider the Perrys have their own hangar. The whole way through they have their own hangar. The OHPs. But the thing was, they're an ASW asset. This is an Aegis asset, which does task group duties. There's a difference. And you can see how they become more general purpose because they gain the hangar. But Watkins is really who hosts that debate. Well, no, Haywood is really who hosts that debate. Watkins deals with that debate and starts making the orders. And starts ordering what becomes the first Burkes. The first Burke. And then it's Trost that they're launched and delivered under. And this is a really interesting thing for me because it's how does the USN evolve in that time? How does the USN change in that time? You see, what the Burkes represent to me is Zumwalt realistically wasn't giving answers. He was asking the US Navy a lot of questions. As a leader, he was asking the US Navy a lot of questions. This is one of the reasons why he causes so much trouble. He's asking questions. He's asking them to think about whether some of their cherished beliefs really are the case, whether they are prepared to really fight a war, whether they really are prepared for the future, whether they really are prepared for what they need to do, you know, whether they really made the right decisions. And you need leaders like that because sometimes you can get stuck in complacency. The trouble is, the leaders who ask those questions and who set the force up to ask those questions will often not be around for the answers. Because it's going to take you possibly, as it did in this case, about another 8 years or 2 CNOs times to get to the answers. And then it's going to be a case of managing the transition. And you're going to be managing the transition always in a changing world, because whilst the Navy might have come up with an answer and a solution, how much were the politicians involved with it? To what extent were the wider public involved in it? To what extent was the wider political class involved in it? To what extent was the nation involved in that decision-making and discussion process? And the answer is probably not a lot. Anyone who was involved were probably people who were naturally inclined and interested in going out their way to get involved, if they were listened to at all. But thing is, once the Navy's decided to make a change, it then has to sell everyone else on making that change. And if they haven't been part of the process to come to the decision to make the change, that's going to be a lot more difficult. Which is why you tend to have a period of transition. And trying to get everyone on side. All your stakeholders involved. So the Burkes, when they come about in their original form, really are, to me, the point at which the US Navy feels it has answers to the questions that Zumwalt has asked and is able to move forward. I would argue, though, that they are overdue to have an admiral like Zumwalt at CNO. They are overdue having someone who's going to ask questions. Whether they can stand to go through a period of transition at this point is entirely up to you, whether you think that's the case. But they are overdue in getting an admiral like Zumwalt. Someone who you can point to as someone who was prepared to ask the questions. And it's the scariest thing to do as an admiral. Someone who has spent their whole life being trained to give orders, be certainty, give answers, tell people what to do. As a junior officer, a senior officer, and as an admiral, that's what they've done. To suddenly ask questions you don't honestly know the answer to. You have an opinion, but you don't know the answer to until you've heard everyone else's answer. And that's a scary thing for an admiral to do, to ask those questions. And that's why I wanted to finish on this. I know, these last ones haven't had the same time, but they've been, in many ways, we're dealing with a different era. We're dealing with an era where the construction time of ships, the construction programs, means it's going to span more than one officer. Where it's going to take more time to get them into service, and therefore that gives more people the time to be involved, and means it becomes more of a collection of personalities than an individual's personality. It's a sad reality in some ways. But with that being said, these officers all had their impact on shaping the Burke. Zumwalt asking the questions. Hollywood and Hayward seeking answers to them and consensus. And Watkins, then Trost, turning those answers into steel. All of them had a part in the process. All of them played their part. And with that being said, I'd like you to think about your own examples and put them in the comment section. And maybe I'll do another one of these videos using your examples at some point, and I'll reference all the people's suggestions. But yeah, put in another one of what you think are ships and, who have reflected their builders and how you think they've reflected them. I'd say the Burkes reflect that what they were starting out looking for was a general purpose all-rounder, turned into a general purpose all-rounder, but rather than being necessarily the low-end escort to the TICO's high-end escort, ended up as, I would argue, a medium to high-end escort. Now, I thought it might be interesting to extend this discussion a bit further. So this is a bonus. This is Space Marine 2, which I'm currently doing on my Twitch channel. And this is inside the Ultramarine ship. And I thought I'd do a bit of discussion about what's going on here. Well, we have some... That's good. If we look around here, one of the things I don't like about it is that whilst I can understand it does fit the Gothic scenario and all these things, this huge open space in ships, not good. Doesn't matter if they're sea ships or spaceships. Open spaces like that are security nightmares for if enemy board you, but also they are fire nightmares because they allow fire to spread and all sorts of things to happen. You really don't want them. You really don't. Honestly, this is steampunk, but it is not what you'd want a ship to be. Admittedly, there are naked flames going on around here, so, you know, we'll leave that to one side. This is the joy that is known to be Warhammer. I am really not keen on this design of a spaceship. Again, it's also got a whole load of stairs in there. Yes, it makes it grandiose. But along with the huge frigating windows... Look at these windows. You can have void shields, yes, but having such massive windows... It can help you see outside, but there's no help in a space fight because you shouldn't be that close of range. Looks gorgeous. It looks visually impressive. If you were on ground, it's exactly what you want. Because it's going to let in a lot of light. It's great architecture. For commanding operations in the space... Yeah. This guy was serving in another bar to the Space Marines, for those who don't know much about Space Marines. And he was sent there because there was suspicion, but not proof. And after 100 years, pretty much serving in that section, he got wounded and he's gone back to his old section. It's basically imagine Borg, but organic. Replicators, but organic. If I'm going to put you through this before I take you to the hangar to show you the hangar, which is even more fun, I should at least explain it. So we have someone who's been running what we call a stag squad, or a stag, like a stag ship when it's not got an admiral aboard. Well, how do I put this? Old phrase. Then the new version of a stag ship became it was all male ship, and then also things. But private ship used to also sometimes called a stag ship. A private squad was a sergeant-led squad, so it was his squad. Now he's got an officer to deal with. That's going to make him happy, isn't it? It's really not going to be fun here. Is there a Space Marine being sick below here, do you think? Because he's sort of leaning over, puking. Is it because he can see so much out the windows it's giving him space sickness? No, oh no, he's wearing his helmet, so he's puking into his helmet. By the way, these two, if you're under the pressure they're going to be any assistant in the missions whatsoever, they basically won't. They might occasionally save your life. No, I'm not going to get friends, and I don't want to get friends for this bit. So, yes, here we go, upstairs. Stairs on something which is not a cruise liner doing it for the impressions, but is actually on supposedly a warship. A huge, open lift structure. I suppose it does make it easier to stick things in. I suppose it's kind of like an old-style hangar lift on an aircraft carrier, but... And here we have a hangar. Now, the gantry cranes, they're good. The gantry cranes, they make sense. They really do. And you can't hear the audio output that's sort of going on because I've got that turned off. But you can see, hopefully see the chat of their discussion going across. But, that was just in case there was a language which make YouTube upset. This stuff, yeah. We have all these gantries mounted up here, all these different positions. From an aircraft launching perspective, that is an absolute nightmare, and it is absolutely terrible. For someone who's trying to rapidly launch aircraft, this is not what you want to do. You want them on one deck, because if this aircraft has a trouble, fire could spill down into this one to this one. Whereas if they're on the same deck, you can contain a fire. There are also issues where they're taking off. And I know there's someone who's going to say, well, this is maximizing space for rapidly launching. No, for rapidly launching, you don't want to necessarily just maximize space. You want to maximize efficiency, which means, again, you want a similar level. Now, we can walk around here and have a look at these lovely people. But, yeah, these are their various landing ships, which are not bad. They make sense. They do make sense. There's lots seems to be going on. Various missiles. Not being carried correctly. That's never good. Never good. But yeah, once you also see the scale for the ships going out down there versus the ships here, this place actually seems to muck its scale about a bit and makes it really doesn't work. Anyway, we will now finally reach our vessel, which is this one we're going to be landing on, and this is going to be supporting us in. It's a fairly good aircraft, but I'm not sure I'd want to be going in it. Yeah. Ooh. Mission terminal. Always fun to have these come up. And now you have battle maps and things. Just a little bit of advice. Not yet Avraks available. So let's carry on. This is very much the beginning. And then it's reached the troops. So here we go. Hope you enjoyed that little guide around Space Marine 2 in terms of their ship design. Life happens sometimes, but I look forward to hear what your ideas. What else we got coming up this year? Well, next week we have Ito Sukiyaki and Yamato Gonai forging the Imperial Japanese Navy with the 6-6 fleet plan. And I did Gonai. Really weird, didn't I then? Well, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and thank you for, if you liked the video, please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow, and thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for doing everything you do of making this channel possible. It wouldn't be possible without you. Take care and have a nice evening. Hope you enjoyed the premiere.